Afternoon, this hearing of the Congressional Executive Commission on China will come to order. The title of this hearing is the Communist Party's Crackdown on Religion in China. And we'll have one panel that will testify today. It'll feature Miragul Tursun, a Uyghur Muslim who was interned in and survived a Chinese quote-unquote political re-education camp. That's not what I call it, that's what they call it, but in fact it is something more nefarious than that. Translating for her is Ms. Zubaira Shamsheddin. She is the Chinese Outreach Coordinator at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. We'll also hear from Tom Farr, President of the Religious Freedom Institute, and Samantha Hoffman, a visiting academic fellow at the Mercator Institute for China Studies and non-resident fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So I want to thank you all for being here. The Chinese government, under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, has long imposed harsh policies against unregistered Christian churches, Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong practitioners, and other religious adherents. The Commission maintains a political prisoner database, and since that database was created, it has featured some 6,275 cases involving individuals detained because of their religion. Currently, there are more than 750 active cases and countless others whose names we will never know. The Commission consistently advocates for members of Congress and the administration to raise individual prisoner cases, and the database is an invaluable tool in that effort. Religious freedom in China is a vast topic, and we will only begin to scratch the surface of it today. But consider the following. Uyghur Muslims are rounded up and interned in camps. Tibetan monks and nuns are forced to undergo political re-education sessions. Falun Gong practitioners are reportedly sent to legal education centers for indoctrination. Churches are shuttered, crosses removed, and Christian believers harassed and imprisoned. These are the daily realities in Xi Jinping's China, and it leads many observers to describe the current wave of repression as the most severe since the Cultural Revolution. Even as the government has carried out an extensive campaign to ensure ideological loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party above all else, impacting various sectors of society, not the least of which are religious communities, it has also targeted those who represent and advocate for them. Not just the communities, but those who represent them and advocate for them. The 709 crackdown, as it was called, saw scores of rights lawyers and advocates detained, arrested, and tortured, forced to ingest unknown medications and confess to crimes that they did not commit. These brave men and women have been at the tip of the spear in representing China's repressed and persecuted Christians and Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, and Falun Gong practitioners. Of the rights lawyers who have courageously defended the rights of their fellow citizens in Chinese courts, several continue to serve sentences, including Wang Chengzheng, Zhang Tenyang, and Gao Zhu-sun, those who have independently documented the truth of Chinese citizens persecuted for their beliefs became targets of the persecution themselves. One fearless example is citizen journalist and human rights defender Huang Qi. We are extremely concerned that he is in danger of making the ultimate sacrifice for telling these stories because his government is currently deliberately denying him access to medical treatment while he is in prison. However, set against this grim backdrops, something remarkable has happened. The number of religious adherents in China has grown. This shows the utter failure of the Chinese Communist Party's policies in this regard. Today's hearing provides an opportunity to better understand the scale and the scope of the current crackdown, to identify cross-cutting trends across different religions, to examine the elevated role of the United Front Work Department, and what this means for China's faithful, and to put forward policy recommendations to address this crisis. This commission has been particularly seized this year with the ongoing crackdown in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, targeting Uyghurs and other ethnic minority Muslim groups. Our annual report that was released in October described these grave abuses at length, abuses which I believe, and most would agree, constitute crimes against humanity. During a July hearing on Xinjiang, we heard sobering testimony from Ms. Gulchera Ojha, a Radio Free Asia Uyghur Service journalist and an American citizen who had been personally impacted by the crackdown. Dozens of her own family members have been detained, have disappeared. And as sobering as her story is, she's not alone. Not only have her fellow Uyghur service journalists been similarly impacted, but countless other Americans have as well. It seems that every week the commission, which we chair, is contacted by Uyghurs living in the United States desperate for news about a loved one who has vanished into the growing labyrinth of camps. Today we are honored to have with us Ms. Tursun. Her story is harrowing, and we are truly grateful for her courage in coming forward. Also grabbing headlines in recent months is the growing repression facing Christians in China. Beijing authorities recently banned Zion Church, one of the largest unofficial Protestant churches in the city, which typically drew up to 1,600 worshipers on any given Sunday. Robbed of their worship space, members of the church have reportedly taken to quietly meeting in parks and in homes. In September, reports emerged of authorities burning Bibles and compelling Christians to sign papers renouncing their faith. Meanwhile, the Holy See and the Chinese government apparently have reached an agreement this fall, the precise details of which have not been made public. It has been reported that Beijing would now recognize the Pope as the head of the Catholic Church in China. The Vatican would recognize 7 excommunicated Chinese bishops appointed by the PRC authorities. The Chinese authorities would appoint future bishops, while the Pope would have veto power over their nomination. There is growing concern, rightfully so, that this agreement may put in greater peril those Catholic believers who maintain as part of their faith that they cannot and will not worship under clergy that have been selected by the Chinese government. There is also alarm that any deal betrays the memory of Catholics who refused to renounce papal supremacy and were persecuted for it, while demoralizing those who still stand faithful. As the hearing title denotes, the Communist Party is at the center of this crackdown. The party's Central Committee issued a massive restructuring plan for party and government agencies to be completed by the end of this calendar year. The United Front Work Department, which Xi Jinping, like Mao before him, calls the magic weapon of the Communist Party, was further empowered in this reorganization. This year, its role in overseeing religious affairs was expanded, underscoring the party's enduring fear that the growth of religious belief is a threat to their grip on power. As the party conducts United Front work to ensure that outside groups are in line with its agenda, the evidence is also clear that Chinese officials are only too willing to expand their repression overseas to intimidate and harass Americans and legal permanent residents of the United States, including those in the Uyghur community. Ms. Tursun's story reminds us that China's suppression of religious faith and religious communities is real. It is evil. It is too horrendous to ignore. In the 21st century, we must not, cannot, and should not accept the mass internment of individuals based on their religious faith, on the basis of their cultural identity, nor can we accept the efforts to stamp out all unofficial religious communities in China that maintain as a matter of faith that they do not want to be beholden to the leadership of the Chinese government or, frankly, any government. Now, without objection, I wanted now to turn it over to Congressman Smith, who's our co-chair, for his opening statement, and then I want to hear from our witnesses, and I want to thank you all for being here. Senator King, I wanted, first of all, Ms. Tursun, I wanted to thank you for coming. I know I could see how difficult the testimony was for you. And I want you to know, and I won't, for purposes of not making this any more difficult for you, I do have here pictures that you've submitted for us of your family and of your 3 children. And we're going to submit those for the record, if that's okay, so that it could be part of the committee's record on this hearing, along with your testimony.
qilib bütün sözlüğünüz için rahmet. Hem ondan siz bizge bir resimden təminlediniz deydi sizin ailənizdən, balalarının deydi. Əgər siz ruxsat qılsınız, onu şu bugünkü şahidlik bəgən materialınız qatıldı. Biz arxivdə saxlab qalımız, ip qalımız. Rahmetlər. Thank you. Okay. Yes, please.
And I want others who are here, I can see people holding up pictures and articles about your loved ones who are unaccounted for. And I want you to know we see that. And if we were to just the sheer volume, the number of cases and individuals who have gone through this is so massive that it would take forever to document it, but none of them are forgotten. The reason why we spend, this is I believe our fourth hearing with other activity that we've done. And but today you've been their voice, Ms. Turson. And I wanted to thank you for that. I have three questions that I hope you can address. The first is, you testified briefly about fear, that even here in the United States you're being watched, harassed, and followed. That is disturbing to us, that in someone living in this country, the Chinese government could try to intimidate, whether it be through phone calls or other activity that you described in your written testimony. The first is, we obviously will talk to you after this to ensure that appropriate law enforcement authorities are aware of this, to ensure that that you will be safe in this country, and that nothing happens, and anyone knows that if anything were to ever happen, we knew who did it. We think is the strongest form of protection. You deserve that. But I wanted you, if you could briefly describe, have you had any incidents recently where you feel, not just a phone call, but individuals have followed you or have felt suspicious that you have been in any way the target of harassment, potentially by those working on behalf of the Chinese government?
Sizniki ma yazmış ayetnamanızda siz şundaq depsiz mesela hatta hazır şu Amerikada bolsanız mı özünüzni hiç bir bexatar his qılmaganlığınız haqida siz mümkün bolsa qısqa aldı bizga tasvirlab bersangiz bu yaqin vaqtda siz telefon orqali emas yoki o'zingiz siz gumondor bo'lgan ba'zi bir insonlarni shu Xitoy hukumatiga ishlaydigan Xitoy tarafdan ba'zi bir insonlarning sizga mishta tahdid bergan yoki sizga mishta bir vahima solgan shunday ahvollar bo'ldimi qisqa shuni tasvirlab bersangiz.
Amerikaga kelgandan keyin bizning uydagilardan dadam, akam, apamlardan tahdid gap kelgandan boshqa yana ikki xil g'ayri nomerdan telefon keldi, men olamadim.
Since I came to America, other than that kind of pressure that I have received from my family members, like my father and the brother's text messages, and also another two suspicious phone calls.
Andan bir qatam shu Virginiyadagi marketni aylanib uyga qaytashimda u bir to'sab manganda shu bir qar ko'zoynaklik qarshab kelgan shu Xitoy chiroyi birisi kenimdan tushib mashin bilan qo'g'lab bir vaga chiqib qo'g'ildi, aynakni tushirib gaqildi, lekin men qo'rqib ketdim. Keyin mashina to'zla qaratdi, men boshqa yo'l qayrilib ketdim, o'sha ishkab oldida.
About 2 weeks ago, in one of the markets in Virginia, I was catching an Uber and traveling, and I felt that some person who wearing black glasses, and also black hat, and that person was with the car, and then he was trying to talk to me through the windows of the car. And the car drove through the different direction. We dropped him. And I scared when he tried to talk to me through the window.
And then driver asked me, you know him? I said, no, I don't know. But I see he is Chinese, I understand. And I let driver go fast, help me to run away. And then they go another way, and this driver keep me in my house. But I'm always worried. All the time I don't feeling I'm safe here. China embassy.
Yes, I mean, probably I just repeat. I don't feel safe here. I don't feel safe here because I always worry that person. Soon I told the driver to just drive it, and then we were able to leave that person. But I always feel I don't feel safe here, even behind me. Like for example, she's just mentioning about this article she brought, and it is from Global Times. In that article specifically, they mentioned her name, saying that what she said and what she. The interview that she has given to Radio Free Asia and everything is lie. And that report says that the report of Global Times recently reported from one of the re-education camps of Xinjiang that the situation, the reporter described it completely different, and it says that what Tursun portrayed or described about the camps is even that kind of situation doesn't exist in Chinese prison. So this is another threat that she felt directly from the Chinese government, which is specifically mentioning her name in the article.
The second question I have is, in your time in camp, were you ever forced to perform work or labor, any forced labor?
Siz aşı lagerda vaqtыңızda sizni mecburi emgek qildimu? Undaq mecburlap bir işlarni emgek qilishga saldımı?
Yo'q, bizni u yerdan chiqartmaydi. Bir uyning ichidan havo chiqishga chiqartmaydi.
No, they don't allow us to go out from the room. They just to lock us in the room. They don't allow us to be out.
So in her detainment, she wasn't even allowed to go out, and even they were basically detained in a sort of confinement with a handful of other people, some of whom died.
Hem siz müşündəxil bir türmədəkilə müşdəx cəh başqalar bilan solaqlı qoyğan solaqda, o solaqda mümkün şu solaqda başqalarının ölgənligini gördünüzmü? Aşındaq bir solaqmı o əmsə?
Mana shu bir kameraga solaydi, bizlarni sirtqa havolantirishga harakatga chiqmaydi. Shu ash kameraning ichiga tarat qilamiz, ashada o'rtirib uxlasaqmi ashada, o'rtirib bir narsa yodlasaqmi ashada. Andan shu o'lib qolganlarmi shu mening ko'z oldimda 9 o'likka men shahid bo'ldim.
It is a cell. We've been locked up with many other people, and if we recite, read something, we do it here. If we go to bathroom, toilet, we do it in the same place. If we stay, we just stay together. I mean, if people dies, it dies among us, and then I have witnessed 9 people to die in front of me.
There have been reports in the press about the forced collection of DNA from people throughout China, but particularly in the Xinjiang region. Some of it under the guise of a physical exam, others forced to provide blood samples and so forth as part of getting passports. In your time there, whether it was getting the passport, are you aware of these forced efforts to make people undergo physical exams, give blood samples, and other? Was that something you were subjected to, either in confinement or when you applied with the authorities on entry or on exit?
Siz aşı vatan vaqtida veyli aşı türmüde bolan, solaqda bolan, meyli yaki sırtı bolan, Xitaylı Uygurlarniki her vaqtda DNA nemisini evrişkisini ilıvatqan aşında ahvallar boğan. O DNA evrişkisini alğanda bəzilərini qan təkşirəyimiz degan yollar bilan, bəzilərini sizlərni jismani salomatlik təkşirəyimiz degan yollar bilan və yoki bəzilərini pasportlarını işləsə yoki bir materiallarni olimiz desə, şu materiallarni elishqi bir shart qilgan asosda ashunda qilib DNA evrişkisini alğan aşında ahvallar boğan. Siz mushundaqlarga şahid bo'ldingizmi yoki siz mushunda ishlarni siz ko'rdingizmi yoki sizning beshingizdan o'tdimi?
Men ashlar shahid bo'ldim, lekin o pasport becerish 2015dan burungi ashunda ba'zi odamlarning ashuna qanalar ekan, lekin 2015dan boshlab hozir qadar bu majburiy tug'ilib 1 oylik bo'lgan bu vaqtdan yosh odamlarning hammasi, qari yoshning hammasi chuqum her bir rayonda o'stirishlik rayonniki oila komitetiga berib hamma odamdan o'xshash qanaldi hozir. Pasport bo'lsin, bo'lmasin, turmaning ichida bo'lsin, turmaning teshida bo'lsin, xizmatchilar bo'lsin, hamma odam 100%. Onu butunlay amalashtirib bo'ldi 2017-yili 10-oyda.
Yes, I have witnessed that kind of practices, taking out the blood sample and doing DNA tests. Before 2015, when you apply for passport, that was one of the requirements that you do have to have a blood test. And after 2015, the doing blood test and the DNA test, everything became compulsory. That compulsory practice applied to from 1 month old baby up until whatever age. So everybody required to do blood tests as well as DNA sampling.
And you may or may not have any reason to know this, but the authorities who have compelled the turning over of DNA of everyone a few months ago put out a contract and for DNA sequencers to be able to account for all of this and creating this massive database. And I regret it's a great shame that one of the companies who has provided those DNA sequencers and frankly takes great pride in the work they do is an American company, Thermo Fisher Scientific, who just recently appeared in an article discussing what a great leader Xi Jinping is, which I imagine from their perspective is driven by the money they're making in that marketplace. And it gets to the broader issue of calling out these American companies who are participating in assisting them in the compulsory collection of DNA for purposes of collecting this massive database against the consent or absent the consent or even the knowledge of the people it's being collected from. And I apologize because I do have a vote and the co-chairman's here and is going to handle, he's got questions. I only wanted to, Dr. Hoffman and Farr, I wanted to just basically say that it seems to me that at the core of all this is an obsessive desire on the part of the Chinese government, which is not new, to create a sort of unified national identity which must be stripped of anything that competes with it. Ethnicity, religion, ethnic cultural tradition. There can be nothing that competes with it, and they appear, as they have been in the past, to be extremely ruthless in their willingness to stamp that out at any cost, whether it's in Tibet or Xinjiang or any other part of their country. And I would add to that in addition to that willingness to stamp out anything that competes with the party for people's loyalties or this national identity, is that when they use terms like extremism and they use terms like dangerous, what they mean by those terms is not violence or advocacy of violence. What they mean by extremist is you don't agree with them or you have loyalties to God or loyalties to a culture or an identity that is not the one they want you to have. Is that an accurate assessment of what their goal is? Is that an accurate assessment of how they define extremism and dangerous?
It's fairly accurate. The Chinese Communist Party, its concept of what we would call national security, I think is better translated as party state security. And party state security is fundamentally about protecting the Chinese Communist Party. And that means that there are dimensions that are dealing with the internal struggle for power within the party, and then dealing with everything outside of the party, controlling the narrative, controlling the ideological space to ensure that the Chinese Communist Party can stay in power. And that means that these state security methods extend far beyond China's borders. And that's why you see the harassment of overseas Chinese, things like the social credit system, to try to essentially ensure that people can manage themselves to adhere to the party's will. It's a long-term process that's not new under Xi Jinping. It's something that the party's been doing forever. The changes at the beginning of the reform era were that the Chinese Communist Party can no longer rely on ideological mobilization alone. And then it had to come up with new ways for enabling Mao's mass line, essentially the idea that that's essentially the idea that the party shapes and manages how people behave. So it's using things like the surveillance state to attach political control to economic and social development. I hope that answers your question.
I think you're exactly right, Senator. I think the Chinese are no different than the other totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. They want to label as extremist anything that challenges them. And just two things that I would cite as evidence. One is bringing the State Administration for Religious Affairs, which has been there in one guise or another for a long time, closer to the Politburo under the United Front Work Department. But also the fact that parents can be given criminal sanctions if they allow their children, any parent in China, if they allow their children to be exposed to religious education. That just tells you everything you need to know. They are afraid that their citizens are going to be infected with the virus of religion. So this is why Mao tried to destroy it. His successors know they can't destroy it, but they're going to try to manage and control, and I think she is simply the harshest of all the post-Mao presidents of China in doing this.